I was complaining to Jeremy that he or whoever chose these questions has landed me with a rather complicated one. Is it wistful? Why do you call me Lord, Lord, and not do what I say? Or is it stern and quite severe? Why do you call me Lord, Lord, and not do what I say? The interesting thing is that this question comes almost as a surprise in a whole context of teachings that Luke has put together here, some of which we find glimpses of humour in Jesus' teaching, again, perhaps unexpectedly. Let me just go back a little while, a few paragraphs earlier than the reading we've just heard. Jesus has been teaching his disciples about the ways of God and the ways God's people live. We have bits about the Sermon on the Mount. We have don't judge others critically. We have love your enemies. We have a whole series of teachings. Part of the ways in which Jesus is trying to show his disciples, you know, in our Hebrew Bible that God's people, the people of the God of Israel, are to live in certain ways according to God's laws and so on. Now, he says to his disciples, you are the people of God. You inherit all those teachings and laws and promises from what we call the Old Testament. You are God's people. You are to live as the community of God's people, obedient to God's new law in Jesus, living in God's ways, and so on. And then we come to the section of Luke's Gospel just before the question that we're thinking about. This is one of the places where Jesus shows his humour. I think he has a twinkle in his eye. He sometimes told riddles or imaginative stories with humour in them. We can imagine people found it quite funny. Here's the first riddle, which we can imagine was quite humorous then, though I suspect today we might think it's a bit inappropriate and actually not very funny. But anyway, here's the riddle. What do you get when one blind man guides another blind man? Answer, they both end up in the ditch. Not living very wisely, we may think. Jesus sometimes uses humour to make serious points. In this case, I've been trying to teach you the ways of God, but some of you are still following teachers and rabbis who teach quite other things. There's something very different from what I've been saying. Wake up, he says to the disciples. Don't end up falling into the ditch with false teachers who are leading you astray. Here's another humorous little paragraph. It's meant to sound ridiculous. Imagine you're trying to get a speck of dust out of your brother's eye and you haven't noticed there's a huge wooden plank in your own eye. Jesus is saying, I've been teaching you not to judge one another. Be very careful how you treat one another. If you're critical of something they're doing, be careful. You think you're helping them get dust out of their eye, but you haven't even noticed the great, huge wooden plank in your own. You're no help at all. That's not what loving your neighbour means. Don't be a judge of your neighbour in this critical way. Then there's a third touch of humour. You know that every tree is known by its fruit. So what would you think if someone tied a bunch of grapes onto a bramble bush? Sounds as though someone's trying to pull a fast one, pretending to be something that it's not. This is about integrity and authenticity. The faith I'm teaching you, Jesus seems to be saying, is about an honest following of God's ways, which bears the good fruit of godly character. If you aren't living out the faith you say you profess, you're as useless as a bunch of grapes tied onto a bramble bush. It's all adding up to something about integrity, something about honesty. Have you noticed how much our media these days gets interested in hypocrisy? Politician being interviewed about the latest policy statement from their department. But I found this quotation from something you said 5 years ago in Manchester, and now you're saying the opposite. Well, knowing how much I changed my mind over the years, I have some sympathy with that politician. But the media are right to underline the importance of doing what you say you're going to do, about living the life you profess, about not pretending to be what you're not. And then we come, in our gospel reading, to the question, why do you call me Lord, Lord, and do not do what I say? He's saying to his followers, true faith comes from the heart. It lives out what it says it believes. It bears the fruit of authentic following of Jesus. We can sometimes, I think, get so caught up with other ideas, other teachings, other opinions and so on, that we might end up in the ditch. We can, even in the Christian church, get so critical of one another that we don't notice the plank in our own eyes. We can look outwardly as though we're bearing the good fruit of loving God and loving our neighbour, but inwardly, sometimes there are grapes tied onto a bramble bush. Why do you call me Lord, Lord, and do not do what I say? Our gospel reading ends with another story, perhaps with another knowing, humorous twinkle in the eye. It's about building on the right foundations. Do you recall about 12 years ago when the Shard was being built near London Bridge? Has 95 floors, 72 of which are habitable, stands just over 1,000 feet above the ground. But when it was first talked about, and for the first few months of activity going on, there was nothing to see. It was all happening underground, down and down and down to 180 feet. So when we talk about the Shard, we only see 2/3 or 5/6 of it. The rest is deep foundations. And the gospel story is about hearing Jesus' words and acting on them. Don't build your house on sand. That's like hearing God's words and not acting on them. Build on the firm foundations of what Jesus says and does, and then live it out. Beware, this whole cluster of little images seems to be saying, beware of the outward show of religion. true faith is a matter of living as Jesus lives, doing what Jesus says. As St. Paul put it in a lovely phrase elsewhere, faith active in love. So where does that take us? When we read about what Jesus says about not getting led astray by false teachers, not giving way to critical judgment of one another, about bearing the fruit of godliness in our lives, I think all these light-hearted riddles and stories are meant to sound ridiculous. It's an interesting sequence. Blind man leading a blind man into a ditch, ridiculous. A plank in your eye, ridiculous. Tying grapes